The room went silent when Clara Whitmore sat beside the Duke of Ashbourne. A gentleman near the wine decanter actually stopped pouring. Across the table, Clara's brother stared at her as if she had mistaken a cliff edge for a chair. Nathaniel Blackwood turned his head slowly. The scar beside his left temple caught the candlelight. "You know who I am?" he asked. "I should hope so." "Your Grace." Our hostess announced you rather loudly. Someone smothered a laugh. Nathaniel did not. "And yet you chose this seat." Clara unfolded her napkin. It was the only one remaining. There is usually a reason for that. She finally looked directly at him. I assumed there was. His gray eyes narrowed. "And you are not curious?" "Very." She reached calmly for her water. But curiosity and fear are not the same thing. Nathaniel stared at her, and for the first time that evening, the feared Duke seemed to have no prepared reply. 6 hours earlier, Clara had been standing beside the drawing-room window at Hartwell Manor while her brother explained why she should make herself useful. "Lady Hartwell invited us because of you," Edward Whitmore said, adjusting his cuffs. "Because of the estate," Clara corrected. The distinction hardly matters. To Edward, distinctions rarely mattered when Clara was expected to repair them. At 31, she had spent enough years standing one step behind prettier young women to become nearly invisible at country gatherings. Society had decided that an unmarried woman past 30 was safe, useful for accompanying nieces, filling card tables, remembering birthdays, and listening to complaints. Clara had discovered there were advantages to being overlooked. People spoke carelessly near invisible women. They also left account books unattended. Lord Pembroke may ask about the North tenants. Edward continued, "Tell him the R's are temporary." Clara turned from the window. "They are not temporary." His fingers stopped at a cuff. "Not tonight. The drainage repairs were delayed again. Clara. And Mr. Fletcher has written twice about the mortgage interest." Edward lowered his voice. "You promised not to embarrass me." "No, I promised not to discuss private accounts unless necessary. Tonight it will not be necessary." Clara held his gaze until he looked away first. "Then I hope no one asks." By dinner, 40 guests filled Lady Hartwell's Camelot dining room. Clara entered near the end of the procession and immediately understood why conversation had developed an unnatural brightness around one end of the table. Nathaniel Blackwood, Duke of Ashbourne, sat there alone. His reputation had arrived before him. 5 years earlier, he had publicly broken with his own uncle during a family scandal. Since then, society had collected stories. Ashbourne was merciless. Ashbourne remembered every insult. Ashbourne had once reduced a member of Parliament to silence with 6 words. Clara had never discovered what the 6 words were. She suspected the story improved every season. 1 chair remained. Beside him, Lady Hartwell glanced desperately around the room. 2 young women suddenly found reasons to adjust their gloves. An elderly baronet became fascinated by the arrangement of his fork. Edward caught Clara's eye and gave the smallest shake of his head. "Don't." Clara looked at the empty chair, then at the Duke, then back at her brother. She sat down. The silence was exquisite. Nathaniel turned toward her. Up close, he seemed less frightening than tired. The scar at his temple was pale, his dark hair touched with silver, and his expression suggested a man accustomed to watching people decide what he was before speaking to him. "You know who I am?" he asked. Clara answered, and the conversation unfolded exactly as the room had feared it might not, without disaster. When Nathaniel warned there was usually a reason his neighboring chair remained empty, Clara said, "I assume there was, and you are not curious." Very, but curiosity and fear are not the same thing. Something shifted in his eyes. The first course arrived for several minutes. Neither spoke. Clara ate peacefully. Nathaniel seemed increasingly suspicious of this. Most people attempt conversation when seated beside me. Would you like conversation? No. Then we are doing remarkably well. His mouth moved almost imperceptibly. Miss Whitmore, is it? Yes. Your Grace. You know my reputation. Several versions. Which do you believe? Clara considered him before answering. None yet. His fingers stopped against the stem of his wineglass. Why? Because everyone who told me about you wanted me to feel something before I met you. Nathaniel's gaze sharpened. And what do you feel now? Clara glanced at the untouched chair on his other side, then at the guests carefully, pretending not to watch them. I think, she said quietly, that everyone in this room is more frightened of you than you deserve. For the first time, Nathaniel's composure cracked. Not anger, surprise. He leaned slightly closer. And what, Miss Whitmore? Makes you think I don't deserve it, because you asked me what I thought. Clara lifted her spoon. Truly frightening men rarely invite an honest answer. Nathaniel watched her for a moment. Perhaps I wanted to know whether you would give one. Then you already suspected I might. I suspected you were either unusually sensible or entirely reckless. Have you reached a conclusion? Not yet. How distressing for you. His eyes changed again. This time Clara was certain she had almost made him smile. The second course arrived, bringing pheasant, roasted vegetables, and enough renewed conversation for the rest of the table to pretend it had stopped listening. Nathaniel said nothing for several minutes. Clara did not rush to fill the silence. She noticed his shoulders ease by degrees. You are very good at this, he said eventually, eating pheasant. Silence. Clara set down her fork. Silence is only uncomfortable when someone is trying to escape his own thoughts, and you never do. Frequently, I simply don't expect strangers to rescue me from them. Nathaniel's fingers rested against his wineglass. You have an answer for everything. No, I have spent years listening to people who assume I have nothing to say. That silenced him more effectively than any clever reply. Across the table, Edward was speaking loudly about improvements at Whitmore Park. We have expanded the western fields, he announced. Very profitable decision. Clara's gaze flickered toward him. Nathaniel caught it. You disagree? It is my brother's estate. That was not my question. Clara looked back at him. The western fields flood every spring. Then why expand them? An excellent question. 1. Your brother did not ask. Her expression warned him away. Nathaniel ignored it. What would you have done? Repaired the drainage channels first, negotiated shorter leases on the eastern acreage, and kept enough reserve to survive a poor harvest. Nathaniel stared at her. You know your brother's accounts. I know the estate. Those are different things, not if one wishes to keep an estate. A small sound escaped him, almost a laugh. Edward heard it. His expression tightened. Clara, he called across the table, do try not to bore His Grace with agricultural matters. Heat touched Clara's face, but her voice remained level. His Grace asked. I did, Nathaniel said. Edward smiled too quickly. My sister has always taken an unnecessary interest in business. Nathaniel's gaze moved from Edward to Clara. Unnecessary to whom? The question landed softly. Edward reached for his wine. Clara felt something unfamiliar. Not rescue. Exactly. Because Nathaniel had not spoken for her. He had merely refused to accept her brother's dismissal. After dinner, the gentlemen remained briefly while the ladies withdrew to the drawing room. Clara took a chair near the fireplace, grateful for the low crack of burning wood. Lady Beatrice Langley settled opposite her with two younger women. "You survived Ashbourne," Beatrice said. "Was it dreadful?" The soup was slightly oversalted. One young woman laughed before hiding it behind her hand. Beatrice frowned. "I meant the Duke. So did everyone else." And Clara looked into the fire. He asked questions and listened to the answers. Beatrice blinked, apparently disappointed by the absence of bloodshed. 20 minutes later, the gentleman entered. Nathaniel was immediately surrounded by men who wanted something from him. Clara watched him become colder with each approach. A smile disappeared. His posture stiffened. His answers shortened. She understood then what she had sensed at dinner. People were not merely afraid of Nathaniel Blackwood. They approached him already armed against the man they expected to meet, then treated his defenses as proof of the stories. Nathaniel glanced across the room. His eyes found hers. Clara did not smile. She simply held his gaze for one quiet second before looking back at the fire. When the group finally released him, he crossed the room. "Miss Whitmore." Clara looked up. "Your Grace, you were watching me briefly and judging me constantly." He sat in the chair beside hers. "Should I be concerned?" "Not yet." The fire cracked between them. Around the room, conversation lowered by an almost comic degree. Nathaniel heard it too. "You see what happens when I sit beside someone." Clara glanced around. I had assumed they were overwhelmed by the furniture. His mouth finally curved into an unmistakable smile. It transformed his face. Clara looked away before he could notice how much she noticed. "Why aren't you married?" he asked, her hand stilled on the arm of the chair. The question was too direct, too personal. Society generally asks that behind my back. I have poor manners, so I have heard. Is there an answer? Clara watched a coal collapse into orange sparks. There are several. Nathaniel waited. He did not soften the question or withdraw it. "And which one is true?" he asked. Clara lifted her eyes to his, the one no one has ever bothered to ask about. Clara let the words remain between them. Nathaniel did not press. That more than the question itself unsettled her. Most people treated silence as permission to invent an answer. He simply waited beside the fire, one hand resting loosely against the chair arm. "Perhaps another evening," Clara said. "Perhaps." His gaze stayed on the flames, though now I am considerably more curious. A terrible burden. I have survived worse. Before she could answer, a man's voice drifted across the drawing room. "Ashbourne, you have stolen our most dependable spare lady." Mr. Julian Carew, a wealthy gentleman with an unfortunate confidence in his own wit, approached with a glass of brandy in hand. Lady Beatrice followed close behind, already smiling. Nathaniel's expression cooled. "Have I?" "Miss Whitmore, of course." Carol gestured toward Clara as though identifying a familiar piece of furniture. Every hostess needs one unmarried woman past 30. Someone must fill the empty chairs when the younger ladies are claimed. A few people nearby laughed. Clara felt the old sensation. Not surprise, not even pain exactly, but the small inward withdrawal she had perfected over years. Nathaniel shifted. She saw the movement from the corner of her eye and spoke before he could. "How fortunate for hostesses, Mr. Carroll." Carroll grinned. You agree entirely. Empty chairs are useful. Clara looked at his brandy. They allow gentlemen who have mistaken cruelty for wit somewhere to sit when everyone else grows tired of them. The laughter stopped. Then an elderly lady near the card table coughed into her hand to hide a smile. Carol's face reened. I was only teasing. Then one of us should have enjoyed it. Nathaniel lowered his head. His shoulders moved once. Carol stared at him. Are you laughing? Ashbourne. Nathaniel looked up perfectly composed. Not anymore. Carol muttered something about finding another drink and retreated. Clara watched him go. You were going to interfere. I was. Why didn't you? You appeared to have the matter under control. I did. I noticed. Something in his tone made her turn. There was no pity in Nathaniel's face. That mattered more than she wanted it to. Most men would have defended me afterward. She said, and received gratitude for saving you. Precisely. That seems inefficient when you were doing so well yourself. Clara's mouth softened. You are surprisingly teachable. Your Grace, do not damage my reputation. Lady Hartwell announced cards, breaking the moment. Clara rose, but Nathaniel's voice stopped her. Miss Whitmore. She glanced back. Being quiet is not the same as having nothing to say. Her fingers tightened slightly around her fan. No, I suspect people confuse the two where you are concerned. Clara looked across the room at Edward, who was laughing with Lord Pembroke. People often believe what is convenient. Nathaniel followed her gaze, including your brother, especially family. She walked away before he could ask more. The next morning brought rain hard enough to trap the guests indoors. Clara escaped after breakfast to a small writing room overlooking the east lawn. She had barely unfolded a letter when Edward entered and shut the door behind him. What did you say to Ashbourne last night? Several things about Whitmore Park. Clara looked up. He asked, You discussed the drainage? Yes. Edward paced once. And the reserve? Yes. Damn it, Clara. His voice dropped. Pembroke heard enough to ask whether our accounts were strained. Our accounts are strained, not publicly. Facts do not become less expensive because we whisper them. Edward planted both hands on the desk. I need Pembroke confident in the estate. Clara studied him. Why? He straightened. Because I do, Edward. Leave it alone. That answer frightened her more than anger would have. Clara folded the letter slowly. How much? His eyes flickered. What? How much money have you borrowed? Silence. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. You manage household expenses? He said, Nothing more. Clara rose. I manage them because you stopped doing it 3 years ago, and you will continue doing exactly what I ask. Not if you've endangered the estate. Edward's face hardened. You forget whose estate it is. Clara's voice became very quiet. No, I remember every day. He left without answering. Clara stood motionless until the door closed. Then she looked down at the letter he had interrupted. It was from Mr. Fletcher, Whitmore Park Stewart. One line had been underlined twice. Miss Whitmore, the creditor, has refused another extension. Unless the outstanding interest is paid within 30 days, he intends to proceed against the estate. Clara read it again, then heard a floorboard creak beyond the half-open door. She turned. Nathaniel stood in the corridor. His eyes moved from her face to the letter, trembling slightly between her fingers. Miss Whitmore, he said quietly, what has your brother done? Clara folded the letter once carefully enough to hide the underlined sentence. I don't know yet. Nathaniel remained in the doorway. That was not the answer of a woman who knows nothing. It was the answer of a woman whose brother's finances are none of your concern. Fair. He stepped back. Clara had expected another question. Instead, he inclined his head. I apologize. She stared at him. That was remarkably painless. Do not become accustomed to it. He turned to leave. Your Grace. Nathaniel stopped. Clara looked at the rain streaming down the window. Asking for help had never come naturally to her. Asking a duke she had met yesterday felt absurd. Do you know Lord Pembroke well? Well enough to distrust him accurately. Would he lend money against an estate already carrying substantial debt? Nathaniel's expression changed. Not unless he expected to acquire something more valuable than the interest. Clara's fingers tightened around the letter. That is what I feared. Nathaniel entered the room but kept several feet between them. How bad? Mr. Fletcher says a creditor may proceed against Whitmore Park within 30 days, and your brother has told you nothing. Apparently, I am useful enough to repair accounts, but not important enough to be told when he destroys them. The bitterness escaped before she could contain it. Nathaniel's eyes settled on her face. You repair the accounts? Clara said nothing. He glanced toward the writing desk. Last night you knew which fields flood, which leases should be shortened, and how much reserve the estate ought to hold. Those things are hardly mysterious. To half the landowners in England, they are sorcery. Despite herself, Clara almost smiled. Nathaniel continued, How long have you been managing Whitmore Park? I don't manage it, Miss Whitmore. She exhaled. 3 years. Since your father's death. 6 months afterward, Edward discovered that mourning did not prevent bills from arriving. She moved to the desk and opened a small leather portfolio. Inside were copies of tenant agreements, repair estimates, crop figures, and correspondence in her neat hand. Nathaniel picked up nothing until she nodded permission. He read several pages in silence. The rain softened outside. From somewhere down the corridor came the distant chiming of a clock. You negotiated this lease? He asked. Yes. And reduced the miller's arrears in exchange for repairs to the southern bridge. It was cheaper than hiring another contractor. You were right. Clara looked toward the fire. Edward presented it as his idea at Christmas. Nathaniel set the paper down. Why did you allow that? Because tenants needed the bridge more than I needed applause. Those are not the only choices. For women like me, they frequently are. Nathaniel's expression hardened, though not at her. No, they are the choices people offer you because you keep making their lives easier. Clara looked at him sharply. The word struck too close. You have known me for less than a day, and in less than a day I have watched your brother dismiss knowledge he depends upon. Carol mock a woman cleverer than he is, and an entire dining room treat your presence as accidental. His voice lowered. I am beginning to suspect very little about you is accidental. Clara's throat tightened. Praise usually embarrassed her. This did not feel like praise. It felt worse. It felt like recognition. Nathaniel returned the papers exactly as he had found them. What do you intend to do? Go home. Examine the ledgers before Edward can prevent me. And if the debt is beyond repair, then I will find out what he pledged. Nathaniel's gaze sharpened. You think he pledged something without telling you? I think my brother has been unusually interested in Lord Pembroke's approval. The door opened abruptly. Edward stood there, his face pale with anger. His eyes dropped to the portfolio between them. Clara, she straightened. Edward. His Grace and I were discussing estate management. Nathaniel's tone was mild. Edward swallowed. Were you? Your sister has unusual ability. Clara exaggerates her involvement. Nathaniel's eyes cooled. Does she? Edward stepped into the room. Our affairs are private. Then perhaps you should stop discussing imaginary prosperity at dinner. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Nathaniel. Both men went still. It was the first time she had used his given name. She had not meant to. Nathaniel looked at her, and the anger in his face changed into something quieter. Edward noticed that too. Clara, he said slowly, may I speak with you alone? Nathaniel waited until she nodded, then left without argument. The moment the door shut, Edward crossed the room. You will stay away from Ashbourne. Clara stared at him. Why? Because you don't understand what you are interfering with. Then explain it. His silence answered too much. Clara placed the creditor's letter on the desk. 30 days, Edward. What did you promise? Penroke. Edward's face drained of color. Where did you get that? What did you promise him? The fire gave a sudden crack behind them. Edward looked toward the closed door Nathaniel had just passed through, then back at his sister. Not what? He said quietly. Who? Who? Clara asked. Edward's eyes shifted away. Pembroke is considering an arrangement. With whom? You know perfectly well. For several seconds she heard only the rain and the small hiss of damp wood in the great mee. Edward rubbed a hand over his mouth. He is wealthy, widowed, respectable, and nearly 60. That hardly makes him unsuitable. No. Offering your sister to a creditor without asking her does. Nothing has been signed yet. Edward's silence confirmed it. Clara's hands became very still. How much does he know about the debt? Enough. And what does he receive if he helps you? Security against the estate, favorable terms, and me. Edward's voice hardened. You are 31, Clara. You cannot behave as though proposals will continue indefinitely. The cruelty was casual, almost practical. That made it worse. She looked at the man whose correspondence she had answered, whose tenants she had protected, whose mistakes she had quietly repaired. You should leave, Clara, before I say something neither of us can pretend I did not. Edward hesitated, then walked out. Clara remained beside the desk until the door clicked shut. Only then did her fingers begin to tremble. She pressed them flat against the leather portfolio. At luncheon she spoke little. Nathaniel sat 3 places away and never once asked what Edward had said. Yet when Clara looked up, she found his gray eyes on her, not demanding, waiting. That evening, Lady Hartwell arranged music in the drawing room. Clara escaped to the conservatory where rain whispered against the glass roof and orange trees scented the cool air. You have developed a habit of finding quiet rooms, Nathaniel said behind her. Clara did not turn. You have developed a habit of following me into them. Should I leave? She considered the question. No, he came to stand beside her, leaving a careful distance between them. For a while, they watched rain thread down the panes. You call me Nathaniel this morning, he said. Clara closed her eyes. I hoped you had forgotten. I have an excellent memory. Another flaw in your character, one of many. The corner of her mouth moved. Nathaniel noticed, but mercifully said nothing. Your brother upset you. That is not difficult. No. He paused, but this was different. Clara looked toward the dark garden. Why do you keep noticing things? Because everyone else appears determined not to. The answer stripped away her prepared defenses. She turned toward him. And why does that matter to you? Nathaniel's gaze rested on her face. I don't know yet. No practice charm, no declaration. The uncertainty made the words more intimate. Clara looked away first. People say you are cruel. People say many useful things when they want to avoid discussing what actually happened. What did happen? Nathaniel's expression changed. He rested one hand on the stone ledge. My uncle used money from a charitable trust to cover private debts. My family wanted the matter handled quietly. Claire awaited. You refused. I gave the trustees the records, and your uncle lost his position. My mother stopped speaking to me for 2 years. Several relatives still believe I disgraced the family. Did you? Nathaniel looked at her. I embarrassed them. They confused that with disgrace. Clara absorbed the distinction. Suddenly, the Fear Duke made sense in a way the drawing room stories never had. So that is why they fear you. Partly because you don't protect people from the consequences of their own choices, not when someone weaker must pay for them. The word struck directly against what Edward had done. Nathaniel saw it. Clara. His voice softened around her name. What did your brother promise? She shook her head. Not tonight. Nathaniel's hand tightened once against the stone, then relaxed. Very well. Again, he did not force the answer. They stood together beneath the rain-dark glass. No flirtation, no rescue, only shared silence. Clara realized with some alarm that she felt safer beside the man everyone feared than beside the brother she had protected for years. You are not at all what I expected, she said. Neither are you. You expected an aging spinster. I expected the woman everyone described. Nathaniel turned toward her. I have yet to meet her. Clara's breath caught quietly. And whom have you met? His eyes held hers. A woman who understands land better than her brother, insults fools efficiently and sits beside dangerous men without asking permission. You are assuming you are dangerous. I have witnesses. She laughed. Then softly but genuinely, Nathaniel smiled, and the distance between them suddenly felt much smaller than it was. He lifted one hand as if to touch hers, then stopped. Clara noticed the restraint, so did he. Neither moved. Footsteps sounded beyond the conservatory door. Edward appeared with Lord Pembroke beside him. Pembroke's gaze moved from Nathaniel to Clara and lingered on the narrow space between them. Miss Whitmore, he said pleasantly, your brother tells me there is a private matter concerning your future that we should discuss. Clara felt Nathaniel go still beside her. Pembroke smiled. Tomorrow morning, perhaps once Mr. Whitmore has shown you the marriage settlement. Pembroke's words seemed to remain beneath the glass roof after he and Edward had gone. Clara did not look at Nathaniel. So now you know. Yes. His voice was dangerously quiet. Do you intend to sign it? She turned. You cannot possibly think that. No, but I have learned not to decide what you think before asking. The anger in Clara loosened by 1 degree. Then no. Nathaniel nodded once. Good. That sounded suspiciously like approval. It was, I do not require it. I know. That answer stopped her. Nathaniel looked toward the door through which Pembroke had disappeared. If he believes financial pressure gives him ownership of your future, I can make his position extremely uncomfortable. Clara almost smiled. There is the feared Duke. He has been waiting patiently. Keep him waiting. Nathaniel's eyes returned to hers. Why? Because if you frighten Pembroke away, Edward will learn nothing except that his sister happened to attract a more powerful man. I was not proposing to frighten him. What were you proposing? Financial ruin was among the possibilities. Clara stared at him. Nathaniel's mouth shifted faintly. "I said among." She laughed despite herself, but it faded quickly. "This is mine to face." "Then face it. You surrender surprisingly easily." "No." His voice lowered. "I am trying to learn the difference between protecting you and insulting you." The words warmed something she had kept cold for years. Clara looked away. "There was another man once." Nathaniel became still. "The answer to my question. Part of it," Rain whispered overhead. Clara clasped her hands before her. "His name was Henry Vale. I was 23. Everyone considered it an excellent match. Did you love him?" "I thought I might." Nathaniel's gaze dropped briefly. "What happened?" "I discovered he had debts, worse ones than Edward has now. He intended to marry me because my father had settled money upon me." She paused. "Then I learned he had struck a servant who threatened to tell me." Nathaniel's face hardened. "You ended the engagement? Quietly?" "Why quietly?" Clara gave a small, tired smile. "Because Henry's sister was engaged to my cousin. A public scandal would have destroyed her prospects too. I said I had changed my mind. Henry told everyone I was cold and impossible to please, and you let them believe him. I thought the truth would hurt innocent people, so you paid instead." Clara's eyes lifted. It seemed cheaper at the time. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "Was it?" She swallowed. No, that single word carried 8 years of whispers. Invitations extended from obligation. Mothers steering eligible sons toward younger women. Edward joking that Clara had become too particular for her own good. Nathaniel's hand rested on the stone ledge between them. "You protected everyone except yourself. Someone had to." "No." His voice was gentle now. "You chose to." "There is a difference." Clara looked at his hand close enough to touch. "You make choices sound very simple. They are rarely simple." Nathaniel turned his palm upward but did not reach for her. "Only necessary." Clara hesitated, then placed her fingertips against his. He closed his hand slowly around hers. No urgency, no possession, just warmth. "Why me?" she whispered before she could stop herself. Nathaniel's thumb moved once across her knuckles. "Because you never asked me to become smaller so you can feel safer." Clara's breath softened. "That is not a very romantic answer. I have been told my manners are poor repeatedly." "Would you prefer a lie about your eyes?" She smiled. "No." "Good. Because your eyes are presently judging me constantly." Their shared laughter faded into silence. Nathaniel lifted her hand slightly, then stopped before bringing it to his lips. The restraint was more intimate than a kiss would have been. "Clara," he said. Footsteps sounded again, hurried this time. Edward entered alone, carrying several folded papers. His face was pale. Clara withdrew her hand, but not quickly enough to pretend nothing had happened. Edward saw. "We are leaving for Whitmore Park tomorrow morning. Why? Because Pembroke has agreed to suspend action against the estate." Clara looked at the papers. "In exchange for what?" Edward placed them on a marble table, the settlement. She unfolded the first page. Her name appeared beside Pembroke's. Below it were financial terms, property provisions, and a proposed marriage date 6 weeks away. Nathaniel came no closer, though Clara could feel the anger in his silence. She turned the final page. Edward's signature was already there. "You signed this. It is only an agreement and principle. Without asking me, I was trying to save our home." Clara raised her eyes. "By selling mine." Edward flinched. "Pembroke will withdraw. If you refuse, the creditors will proceed. Whitmore Park could be lost." Nathaniel finally spoke. "I can purchase the debt tomorrow." Clara turned sharply toward him. Edward went white with relief. "Your Grace, no." Clara's voice cut across both men. Nathaniel stared at her. "No." She folded the settlement and placed it carefully on the table. "If you buy Edward's debt, he keeps his estate, his reputation, and the belief that another person will always pay for his choices, and you could lose your home. Then perhaps I lose it." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Claire stepped closer to him. "You told me necessary choices are rarely simple. I did. Then trust me enough to make mine." For several seconds, the feared Duke said nothing. Then, with visible effort, he stepped back. "Very well." Edward stared between them. "Clara, you cannot possibly fix this." She picked up the marriage settlement and tore it cleanly through her name. "Perhaps not," she said, "but tomorrow I am going to open every ledger you have tried to keep from me. And this time, Edward, I will not repair your mistakes in silence." "Then you will not do it alone," Edward said. Clara looked at him across the torn settlement. "You misunderstand. I am not asking for your assistance." His face wrined. "It is my estate. Then tomorrow you may finally learn what is happening to it." Edward opened his mouth, but Nathaniel moved toward the door. "The lady has answered you." Clara shot him a warning glance. Nathaniel stopped. For one dangerous second, she thought he would use his title and in the argument for her. Instead, he bowed slightly. "Forgive me. Old habits." Edward stared at him in disbelief. Clara almost smiled. "Tomorrow," she said to her brother, "every ledger." By noon the following day, Whitmore Park's library was covered in 3 years of financial damage. Clara sat at her father's old desk with account books stacked around her. Edward paced before the fire. Nathaniel stood near the windows, exactly where Clara had asked him to remain present, silent, uninvolved. Mr. Fletcher, the estate steward, placed another bundle of receipts beside her. These payments were never entered into the household books. Miss Whitmore. Clara examined them. Gambling notes, private loans, payments to brokers, one enormous expenditure connected to the western fields. "Edward, you borrowed against the harvest before purchasing the additional acreage." He stopped pacing. "It was an investment on land that floods." Pembroke said, "Penroke knew it flooded." Clara looked at the dates. Her eyes narrowed. "He encouraged the purchase, then lent you money against it." Mr. Fletcher cleared his throat. "There is more. He produced correspondence bearing Pembroke's seal." Clara read the first letter, then the second. The pattern emerged with sickening clarity. Pembroke had repeatedly encouraged Edward toward expensive ventures, then offered increasingly unfavorable loans when they failed. "He didn't rescue you," Clara said. "He cultivated your desperation." Edward sank into a chair. "Why?" Clara looked at the marriage settlement. "Because eventually you would have something he wanted." Edward's eyes moved toward her and dropped. Nathaniel's hand closed against the window frame. Clara saw it. "Nathaniel." He released it immediately. "Still here. Stay there." His jaw worked once. "I gave my word." Edward gave a bitter laugh. "How touching." Clara turned on him. "Do not mistake his restraint for your innocence." The room went still. "You signed away my future because admitting your mistakes frightened you more than sacrificing me." Edward looked down. "I thought I could repair it afterward. That is what I have been doing for you for 3 years." She opened her leather portfolio and removed copies of correspondence she had kept. Lease negotiations, drainage estimates, tenant arrangements, creditor warnings, and calculations Edward had ignored. She placed them beside the estate ledgers. There is enough here to show exactly which decisions were mine and which were yours. Edward's face changed. You kept copies. I learned to. If these become public, people will know you mismanaged Whitmore Park. Clara, I will be ruined. She looked at him for a long moment. No, you may be embarrassed. I spent 8 years confusing those things myself. Nathaniel's eyes lifted sharply at the echo of his own history. Clara continued examining the accounts until afternoon light faded gray against the windows. Finally, she leaned back. The estate cannot meet the next payment. Edward covered his face. Then we lose it, possibly? Unless Ashbourne buys the debt. Nathaniel said nothing. Edward looked toward him. Your Grace, surely. Do not ask him. Clara's voice was quiet. But he could save us. He could save you from consequences. What difference does it make? Everything. Edward stared at her as if he had never seen her before. Perhaps he had not. Nathaniel finally spoke, but only to Clara. What do you need? Not what shall I do? Not whom shall I threaten? Clara felt the distinction. Time, she said, and access to Pembroke's original loan agreements. Mr. Fletcher shifted. Those may be filed with his London solicitor. Nathaniel nodded. I know the solicitor. Clara raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerously like helping. You asked for access. I asked for time. Then I shall provide neither unless requested. His expression was solemn, but something warm moved beneath it. Clara almost laughed. Before she could answer, wheels sounded on the gravel outside. A carriage stopped before the house. Moments later, the library door opened and a footman entered. Lord Pembroke, Miss Whitmore. Pembroke walked in without waiting to be announced further. He removed his gloves, finger by finger, surveyed the ledgers, and smiled. I see you have discovered the unpleasant arithmetic. Clara rose. I have discovered quite a lot. Pembroke's gaze flicked toward Nathaniel, including a convenient duke. Apparently, Nathaniel's expression turned glacial. Clara stepped between them before he could speak. You will address me. Pembroke smiled wider. Very well. Your brother's payment is due in 12 days. Without it, I proceed against Whitmore Park, and the settlement still available. I tore it in half. Paper can be replaced. Consent cannot. His smile thinned. Then perhaps you should consider what happens when a 31-year-old unmarried woman loses the only home willing to keep her. The cruelty struck exactly where he intended. Clara felt it and remained standing. I have survived being unwanted before. Pembroke's eyes hardened. Not without money. He turned toward the door, then paused. 12 days, Miss Whitmore. After he left, silence filled the library. Edward whispered, What are we going to do? Clara looked down at Pembroke's letters again. One phrase repeated across 3 of them, each attached to a different loan. Valuation confirmed by H, Vale and Company. Her fingers went cold. Nathaniel noticed Clara. She lifted the oldest document toward the fading light. Henry Vale, the man she had refused 8 years earlier, had valued every disastrous investment Pembroke persuaded Edward to make. Clara looked at Nathaniel. This was never only about Whitmore Park. Henry Vale? Nathaniel asked. Clara kept staring at the signature. The man I nearly married. Edward's head lifted. Vale was your suitor 8 years ago. She laid Pembroke's letters beside one another. The valuations bore the same company's seal, each estimating Edward's purchases well above what the properties could reasonably produce. He knew Whitmore Park, he knew my father's settlement, and he knew me. Nathaniel came one step closer, then stopped. "What are you thinking?" That Pembroke did not accidentally lend Edward money against bad investments. Vale made those investments appear sound. Mr. Fletcher bent over the documents. If the valuations were knowingly inflated, then Pembroke's hands may not be clean either, Clara finished. Edward stared at the papers. "You think they planned this?" "I intend to find out." Clara spent the next 4 days doing what society had never imagined a quiet spinster might do. She followed numbers. Nathaniel obtained introductions to 2 solicitors, and then, at Clara's insistence, stepped back. Mr. Fletcher brought estate records. Clara compared valuations, dates, letters, and transfers until the pattern became impossible to dismiss. Ville's company had overstated 3 investments. Pembroke had financed each one. After every failure, he tightened his claim against Whitmore Park. Most damning of all was a letter Edward had forgotten, receiving 2 years earlier. Vale had written to Pembroke, "Whitmore remains easily led. His sister remains the only obstacle." Clara read the sentence twice. Edward sat opposite her, gray-faced. "I never saw that." "You did." She turned the page toward him. His initials marked the corner. "You simply did not understand what you were reading." Edward covered his mouth. "Clara, not now." The confrontation came at Lady Hartwell's assembly 3 evenings later. Pembroke had apparently expected Clara to remain hidden at Whitmore Park until desperation softened her. Instead, she entered the drawing room in a simple dark blue gown, with Edward on one side and Mr. Fletcher carrying a document case behind them. Nathaniel stood across the crowded room. He did not approach. Clara had asked him not to. Pembroke's smile faltered. "Miss Whitmore, have you reconsidered?" "Completely." Conversations nearby faded. Clara placed the first valuation on a card table. "You lent my brother money after Henry Vale's company valued the western acreage at nearly twice its demonstrated income." Pembroke's expression did not change. Business judgments sometimes prove incorrect. Once, perhaps, she placed down a second document. Then there was the mill investment, a third, then the Northern Timber contract. People began turning toward them. Pembroke lowered his voice. "This is hardly an appropriate subject for a drawing room." Clara looked at him calmly. "Neither was discussing my marriage as payment for my brother's debt, yet you appeared comfortable doing that." Lady Beatrice inhaled sharply nearby. Pembroke's face hardened. "Be careful." "I have been careful for 8 years." Clara opened Vale's letter. "That was my mistake." She read only the relevant sentence aloud. "Whitmore remains easily led. His sister remains the only obstacle." Edward flinched but did not retreat. Pembroke looked toward the door. Nathaniel remained where he was, hands behind his back. Clara continued, "Copies of these records were delivered this morning to our solicitor. The validity of the valuations, the lending arrangements, and your conduct surrounding the proposed settlement will be challenged. You cannot prove fraud, perhaps not tonight." Clara closed the case. "But I can refuse you tonight." Pembroke's mouth twisted, and when Whitmore Park is seized, Clara felt the room waiting for her shame. "Then I shall leave it." Edward turned sharply. She did not look at him. "I will not purchase a roof with my consent." For the first time, Pembroke had no smile. He left without bowing. The silence afterward lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Lady Hartwell crossed the room and deliberately offered Clara her hand. Others followed more cautiously. Not everyone approved. Clara no longer cared. Nathaniel approached only when the crowd had dispersed. "You did not need me." Clara looked at him. "I needed you to keep your promise. That was considerably harder. I know. I nearly destroyed Pembroke at least 6 times. Only 6. I am exercising restraint." She smiled. Then she noticed the folded letter in his hand. "What is that?" Nathaniel's expression changed. "The consequence of my choice." He handed it to her. Earlier that afternoon, he had withdrawn from a political agreement backed by Pembroke's closest allies after they demanded that he discourage Claire's challenge. The alliance would have secured support for reforms Nathaniel had pursued for 2 years. "You gave this up because of me." "No." His gaze held hers. "I gave it up because they asked me to become the sort of man I despise. You could have remained neutral. I was neutral while you fought your battle." He stepped closer. "I will not be neutral when people punish you for winning it." Clara's eyes burned. "Nathaniel, you told me not to save you. You never told me I could not stand beside you afterward." This time, when he offered his hand, Clara took it without hesitation. Around them, half the room watched. Nathaniel did not care. Neither did she. "There may still be consequences," Clara whispered. "Whitmore Park may be lost. I know Edward may never forgive me. That is his choice. And society." Nathaniel glanced around the room. "I believe we have both survived society." Clara laughed softly. His thumb brushed her fingers. "There is something I want to ask you," he said. Her pulse changed. Then asked Nathaniel looked toward the crowded drawing room, then back at her. "Not here." Before Clara could answer, Edward appeared at the doorway holding a newly delivered letter. His expression was stunned. "Clara?" She released Nathaniel's hand. "What is it?" Edward crossed the room and handed her the page. Their solicitor had obtained an emergency injunction preventing Pembroke from proceeding against Whitmore Park while the disputed valuations were examined. Clara read the final paragraph and stopped. Henry Vale had learned of the challenge. He was returning to England immediately, and he claimed to possess evidence proving that Clara herself had known about the financial arrangement from the beginning. Clara read the accusation twice, then folded the letter with steady hands. "Let him come." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "You are certain. For 8 years, Henry has depended upon my silence." She looked at him. "I think he has mistaken it for weakness long enough." Vale arrived 4 days later carrying what he called proof, an old letter in Clara's handwriting discussing her father's settlement and Edward's future inheritance. Before a solicitor and 2 witnesses, he claimed it showed Clara had understood the financial scheme and later turned against Pembroke only when the marriage settlement displeased her. Clara read the letter and almost smiled. "This is mine." Edward went pale. Nathaniel remained silent beside the window. Vale relaxed. "Then we understand one another." "No." Clara placed the letter beside the original estate correspondence she had preserved. "You have removed the second page." Vale's expression changed. The missing page retained in Clara's portfolio for 8 years showed that she had been writing about the settlement proposed during her own engagement to Vale and had specifically refused to permit her money to secure another man's debts. The date preceded Pembroke's loans by years. Worse for Vale, the altered letter prompted examination of his company's records. Within weeks, the inflated valuations were traced through correspondence and payment instructions, linking him directly to Pinbroke. Pinbroke's claim against Whitmore Park was suspended, then substantially reduced when the disputed transactions were challenged. Vale's reputation collapsed under the documents he had tried to manipulate. Pinbroke withdrew from society rather than endure the inquiry and whispers he had once expected Clara to endure. Edward escaped neither debt nor consequence. Several parcels of Whitmore land had to be sold. His expensive habits ended, and control of the estate accounts passed into professional hands. One evening, he found Clara in their father's study. "I thought losing part of the estate would be the worst thing that could happen," he said. Clara closed the ledger. And now Edward looked at the shelves. "Now I think the worst thing was nearly losing my sister while pretending I was saving our home." It was not an apology large enough to erase 3 years. It was, however, a beginning. Clara accepted it as such. By spring, Whitmore Park was smaller, solvent, and honest. Clara no longer kept its accounts in secret. Her work appeared under her own name, and several neighboring landowners who had once treated her as decorative began requesting her advice. She enjoyed refusing some of them. Nathaniel enjoyed it even more. He had never asked the question he mentioned at Lady Hartwell's assembly. Clara wondered about it until another supper brought them back to the same camel-at dining room where they had first met. This time, when the guests entered, Clara noticed something peculiar. The chair beside the Duke of Ashbourne remained empty. There were other places available. No hostess had made an error. Nathaniel sat with one hand beside his untouched wineglass, apparently unconcerned. Clara stopped several feet away. "Your Grace." He looked up. "Miss Whitmore, no one seems willing to sit beside you again." "Tragic. Have you frightened them?" "Not deliberately." She glanced at the chair. "Is it reserved?" Nathaniel's expression softened. "That depends on what?" "Whether you choose it." He did not pull the chair out. He did not summon her. He simply waited. Clara understood. The first time she had sat beside him because there was nowhere else to go. Tonight, the room offered a dozen places. She chose his. Conversation continued around them, but Clara heard only the quiet sound of Nathaniel's breath as she settled beside him. "You said you wanted to ask me something," she murmured. "I did. You have taken several months. I wanted to be certain you had somewhere else to sit." Clara turned toward him. Nathaniel's gray eyes held hers. "Clara Whitmore, I do not want to rescue you, manage you, or be thanked by you. An unusual proposal so far." His mouth curved. "I want your judgment when mine fails, your silence when words are unnecessary, your disagreement when I deserve it. I want you beside me because you choose to be there." His voice softened. "Will you marry me?" Clara looked at the feared Duke society had warned her against and saw the man who had learned to stand back when love demanded restraint, then stand beside her when loyalty demanded courage. She placed her hand over his. "Yes, Nathaniel, I choose you." They married quietly that summer. Years later, on winter evenings at Ashbourne, 2 chairs always stood near the library fire. Sometimes Nathaniel read while Clara worked over estate papers. Sometimes they talked. Often they simply shared the silence that had first made them curious about one another. And whenever Clara found him watching her, she would ask, "What?" Nathaniel always gave the same answer. "Still noticing you." Thank you for listening to Clara and Nathaniel's story. Please like this video, comment your favorite moment, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable historical romance stories.